G'day folks, and welcome to this discussion of Confederate cavalry and Union supply in Mark Simnish's game, The US Civil War. So I've done a few videos on Union thinking, Union strategy, Union plans. I thought I'd talk about what the Confederates do. So whilst the Union tends to have the initiative and tends to be driving the agenda, the Confederate cavalry plays an important role in kind of undermining that. For the Union to support their drive, they need to wage this large offensive into the southern states. To support that and to secure the victory points they need to meet their benchmarks each turn, they need to have very solid supply lines. And supplies are drawn from primary supply sources, which can be rail hexes along the northern edge. They can be ports. For the most part, though, for these southern campaigns, the Union is drawing supplies from the north. They're coming down either the Mississippi River, navigable rivers, or along their critical rail roads, which weave throughout these southern states. So controlling the Mississippi and these rail lines, these rail networks, is critical to supporting that offensive in terms of maintaining supplies, but also in terms of strategically relocating new troops as they arrive each turn. The Union gets a lot of new troops each turn, 2 in St. Louis, 3 in Illinois, and 3 in Indiana and Ohio. That's 8, which they can direct towards this theatre if they can get those supply networks in effect organised quite well. You can, with good organisation, direct all 8 of those reinforcements in this area down to southern Alabama. You can even bring in reinforcements from the east if you really want to, along this rail network towards really with the front of where the fighting is. Confederate cavalry then wants to undermine all this. They want to disrupt those supply routes, those strategic redeployment routes to prevent, for example, McClellan, McDowell, Curtis from replenishing their armies after these exhausting battles. Confederate reinforcements are placed in these states. So Johnson can place his reinforcements in Selma if that's where they're lost. The North has to place them in the north and then rail or river them back down to the south. So yeah, Confederates cavalry then plays that critical role in stopping those reinforcements, or trying to stop those reinforcements from arriving, and undermining the ability for the Union to draw those reinforcements and, if feasible, supply as well. There's 2 considerations here. There's the arrival of reinforcements, which arrive at the start of each turn, and there's supply. And if they can cut off the supply network, much more difficult, but if they can cut off supplies, then many of these Union armies will be forced to forage and suffer attrition, and I guarantee you they will lose a lot of SPs if that happens. So yes, so the Union. All these flags represent control markers on towns or objective resource hexes, which designates Union control, which enables then supplies to pass through those areas. They can serve as supply depots. So, for example, we have over here Pikeville serving as a supply depot, and it can link up with Tuscaloosa because it's less than 4 movement points away. What this means is that Grierson here can draw supplies along these supply depots back to a rail line, which can flow back to a northern state. So, for example, here's the primary Union rail line through Kentucky. It flows down through Bowling Green, Nashville, down here across the river to Decatur, down here to Corinth, and then down here, where, quite recently, it was cut by, I think, Nathaniel Bedford Forrest's incursions, that he wreaked havoc along this rail line and disrupted it. Over to the western Mississippi, there's this rail line here. This is not so much about supplies. This is about reinforcing this Union drive towards Vicksburg and Jackson. What it means is I can now send reinforcements down the river to Memphis, and they can jump on a train and head straight down here to reinforce Warren or Thomas as they try to exhaust the Confederate defenders of Vicksburg. Something similar was happening in the center here, where I had Grant driving around Meridian, and I was trying to use this rail line to get his reinforcements down. So the Confederates are trying to stop that, and to do so, it is as simple as moving a Confederate cavalry unit into the space with a Union control marker. So if I imagine 1, 2, 3, now Confederate cavalry must spend 1 extra movement point to remove a control marker. 4, 5, 6. It's as easy as that. It is hard work for the Union to place all these control markers. This is the result of over a year's worth of campaigning throughout Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. It is exhausting work with these slower moving Union infantry commanders, some of which are very slow, to place these control markers. It costs a movement point to place a control marker. So you can imagine poor, slow Thomas standing up here in Holly Springs is going 1, 2, 3 to place a control marker. Next turn, 1, 2, 3 to place a control marker. Next turn, 1, 2, 3 to place a control marker. Very slow for these generals. Grant and Sherman, with their movement rates of 5, have an easier job of it, but it's still slow going. And these fast-moving cavalry commanders with a movement rate of 7 can quite easily get behind these lines and remove a lot of markers quite quickly. The trick, and I guess the key to their Confederate cavalry success in this regard, is finding a route behind the Union lines to avoid Union forces, cause maximum destruction, and try to survive themselves. Because they are so devastating once they get behind the line. So Forrest was around here, and you can see what's happened here. This is a result of Nathaniel Bedford Forrest being caught around this Columbus area. I can't exactly recall how this happened, but Forrest was somewhere around here and had been disrupting Union lines. And when the Union sees an opportunity to pounce on and destroy a Confederate cavalry unit, they try to seize the opportunity. So I think what happened was Stanley tried to move in like this, and then McClernand came in and attacked him and prevented Forrest from avoiding battle, forced the battle, surrounded him with zones of influence, and thus forced his elimination. I think something like that. I could be recalling it wrong, but that's roughly what happened, and that's exactly what the Union wants to do. They see Confederate cavalry behind the line. They need to consolidate and pounce, because unchecked, this cavalry can just keep going. The further they move, so imagine Morgan clears this out, not only are they disrupting Union supply networks, they're also extending their own supply network to move forward. So what we have here now is, the reforging of a Confederate supply depot network, which means that Morgan can keep going further into Confederate territory, into those Union-held areas. So yes, the Confederates, and I'll just show you Forrest as well, their attributes. They have very high movement allowances, 7. They have their attack rating and defense rating in parentheses. What this means is that they're only used when serving as an independent cavalry unit. So cavalry units just have the 1 SP running around. They're very limited in what they can do. So they can't gain control of enemy areas, but they can remove enemy Union control markers from Confederate states. So it's much more difficult when the cavalry heads into the northern states, but it's much easier to fulfill this function here and to disrupt those Union control markers. So they have a +2 attack rating, very good when attacking. They don't want to attack too much because they've only one SP, but you compare this with the Union cavalry leaders, who tend to have 0s and 0s, and if we're lucky, they have 1s. So Gregg, for example, way up in the north, has a 1. Pleasanton has a 1, but Stoneman, for example, here is a 006. Grierson here is a 107. They're very poor on defense, and they tend to have slightly lower movement rates compared to the Confederates. Their 2 defense rating is also important for avoiding combat. So it's a +2 modifier in defense if they're ever attacked by, let's say, Union cavalry, but it also helps them to avoid battle. There's a +2 for their defense rating, another +2 because they're cavalry. they're all but guaranteed of avoiding battle, which means that you kind of have to isolate them in that way. You have to bring one unit along to kind of pin them and another unit along to prevent them from avoiding battle and forcing the battle then. What happened before McClellan actually tried to do that? I believe Stanley tried to attack Forrest and failed, and then I think Grierson tried to attack Forrest and failed. Luckily, none of these two Union commanders lost their SP, but you often need a small mobile infantry force to help deal with those cavalry. And again, as I said, if left unchecked, they can do a lot of damage. So yes, the Confederate cavalry commanders are vastly superior to the Union cavalry commanders. They're better attack ratings, better defense ratings, better movement values, and there are more of them. Usually just not a lot more, but usually one or two more Confederate commanders than there are Union commanders in a theatre. This kind of is a compensation for the superiority of Union forces. By the time the Union is in Mississippi, Alabama, they usually outnumber the Confederates, and it's up to this Confederate cavalry to slow them down. By disrupting supplies, they're forcing McClellan, for example, and Stanley, they're forcing the Union to spend actions on chasing them down, which is slowing down Sherman and McDowell and Curtis and Warren and Thomas and what they want to do, which is to capture these Confederate objectives. So the Confederates are just disrupting these supply lines, denying control to slow the Union down, force them to come back and rebuild these things and spend their actions on stuff they don't really want to be doing. It's a different story. So that's the Confederate cavalry strategy in the Western and Trans-Mississippi Theater. It's a different story up in the North. Up in the North, the tables are effectively turned. They cannot easily gain control. So the Union cavalry here can't move into Tuscaloosa and place a control marker. They're not allowed to. You need 2 SPs to place a control marker. But if they stay there at the end of the turn, Tuscaloosa will change sides. That's basically only one area or one control marker for a cavalry unit throughout the course of a turn, so it's much slower going. Hopefully that gives you some insight into just kind of another layer of consideration that you're making when playing the US Civil War. There's this whole kind of cavalry battle going on throughout the course of the campaign, and it's a really fascinating aspect